awful IPs and offensively bad original ideas to, well, whatever you want to call this atrocity, we've all been victims of at least one of HHN Orlando's most disappointing nightmares. I'm SixBillium, and in the 125 HHN haunts that I've experienced, there's definitely been a few that have made me feel like I was this guy. In this first episode, we'll trek through the darkest corners of Orlando's worst haunts, while also exploring the art of the scare and the evolution of the event. If you love Halloween Horror Nights and are brave enough to relive the terrors of the last 15 years, this is the series for you. This is finally the HHN Countdown. All the way from 2010 to, well, now, we'll cover every single haunt. But before we can explore the best, we have to uncover why these haunts weren't that good. I'd argue that most of HHN's failures derive from an over-reliance on formula, and occasionally one of the worst things possible, brand synergy. Ugh. To showcase not only what qualities made a haunt memorable for all the right reasons, but more importantly to highlight how their absence had just the opposite effect, HHN's very own Heralds of Fear will join us on this journey. Now let's get started with perhaps the scariest haunt on this list, but for all the wrong reasons. And it should come as no surprise to see 2016's Lunatics Playground. You won't stand a chance at the very bottom. You don't expect to find something that looks this cheap at one of the most immersive resort destinations in the world, especially in a headliner for the event icon. Despite a few interesting ideas, the legendary Shady Brook Asylum, which we'll explore plenty more later on, didn't deserve this downgrade to a sea of neon paint and flat black walls. A haunt should never have to try this hard to be memorable, attempting to compensate for the lazy designs with in-your-face shock value. Save for the exceptional characters who always gave it their all, you won't stand a chance at remembering much that was good about this haunt. And despite having one of the best ideas in HHN history, 2015's The Purge was one of the most grueling exercises in sensory overload that I've ever experienced. Yes, horror is built around loud noises and jump scares, but when it's all just noise after noise after noise, you quickly realize that loud and scary are not the same thing. The Purge afforded nearly zero opportunities for effective scares, outside of pulsing fake victims through the conga lines that would be purged and blessed with an early exit. Rarely has HHN found the balance between action and horror when it comes to these more high-octane concepts, but it comes down to the same old ideas getting real old, real fast with no variety. But it's what this next haunt did that's almost more unforgivable. What does a remake need to justify its existence? A purpose, a reason to exist outside of what was showcased in the original. And that was not the case with Halloween 2022. Michael Myers has starred in some of the greatest haunts I've seen at Universal. So did this new version innovate on previous entries? Nope. Was it more detailed? Not really, it was just bigger and emptier. Was it scarier? Well, Michael Myers is a master of the cat and mouse chase, and Halloween was the antithesis of that. The choice to put Mikey in the spotlight instead of the shadows was a fundamental misrepresentation of the slasher legend. John Carpenter's iconic score remains a highlight, as always, but also serves as a reminder that the only good things about Halloween 2022 were things that had already been done. Which is something that a lot of 3D haunts are also guilty of. I promise it's not an automatic death sentence, but in the case of 2013's Afterlife, Death's Vengeance, it was. Now, the story of Bobby the Blade is one for the ages. A remorseless serial killer trapped between life and death, eternally tortured by his victims in the same way they were murdered. Which is exactly why it's such a bummer to see an over-reliance on the same old tricks. Hey buddy, you're not up for a while. After a brilliant opening drenched with a southern-soaked atmosphere you could practically feel, the recycled ideas and uninspired visuals after Bobby's electric death, not that one, have sadly kept Afterlife stuck in purgatory. But what does it look like when a haunt tries so hard to do something new, but it falls completely flat? Across the park in 2013 lay Havoc Derailed, a legacy sequel to 2010's House of the Year, Havoc Dogs of War. Except this time, these genetically mutated super soldiers were confined to a small, moving prison transport. At least for a little bit. I applaud the choice to do something completely different from the original, creating brand new lighting effects to simulate a moving train and designing the biggest and smallest sets to date in the disaster queue. But the execution was way too chaotic and not in a good way. The linear train scenes were too similar with limited opportunities for scares, and once Havoc finally derailed, it became a nonsensical junkyard with every single good idea or hiding spot blinded by the never-ending strobes. Perhaps the biggest pitfall of Havoc Derailed was also the reason we no longer see many haunts like this. As we've established, loud does not equal scary. Ugh. Case in point. And that's where many of the less horror-centric haunts have failed, forgoing suspense for a library of stock audio effects from obviously fake props that dismantle the realism. Luckily, Universal is nothing if not innovative, and found a way to turn one of their most repetitive scare tactics into one of their most compelling. Instead of simply making the guests the targets, why not make them the spectators? Where these scenes were a dime a dozen, now each one becomes its own cinematic scene, adding to the immersion with special effects and greater narrative value. That's not to say Universal hadn't dabbled in the approach before, but now each one of these scares consistently has a unique identity, a purpose if you will. And that theme is important as we continue this countdown. Every scene, every idea, every scare needs to be able to justify its existence to be successful. Take 2017's Saw, The Games of Jigsaw, for example. The tension from this series comes from the uncertainty of beating the dreaded timer, and of course the inevitable explosion of viscera that follows. So it's questionable that The Games of Jigsaw hardly acknowledged the aftermath, while also doing as much as it could to avoid the buildup, simply scattering a litany of anticlimactic vignettes throughout. I'll give it props for capturing the sickly, desaturated palette of the films and the rapid-fire gauntlet mixing up the pacing. But without much payoff, it's hard to say if any of these games even mattered. Sometimes you know an IP won't translate well, but it stings even more when all the ingredients for a cult classic are there. I truly wanted to love Ash vs. Evil Dead. I tried so hard in 2017 to wrap my head around the askew set design and the decision to relegate the charismatic Ash Williams to just his quips and gross out scenes. Seems like post-credits Ash wasn't the only one who had a few too many. For what should have been a riotous and gory romp simply felt like a slog, a chore to walk through. The Evil Dead franchise has the holy trinity of gore, scares, and atmosphere to boot. But man, this cabin scene is so disappointing, it's unforgivable. And I don't think I need to explain how that feeling translated to 2015's Run, Blood, Sweat, and Fears. But at least I can still fondly look back on how pulse-pounding this impeccable intro was, and the bathroom scare was maybe one of my favorites of the year. Sadly, what followed was surface-level caricatures set within an apathetic version of the legendary Hellgate prison, squandering any potential for intensity or sets with personality. But the campiness wasn't the downfall of Run. Some of the greatest haunts of all time have been funny, even riotously hilarious. But beneath all the punchlines, there was still a strong foundation that Blood, Sweat, and Fears lacked. With scare tactics this elementary, I've never been so bored being chased by the most skilled assassins in the world. And bored is how I felt during most of 2014's Dracula Untold. Many haunts on this list have paled in comparison to their source material, but this one was not one of them. The movie absolutely sucked too. Completely disconnected from the Count we all know, the best parts of this haunt had nothing to do with him, or made any sense to the story, which undercut how strong they could have been in another haunt. At least the Universal parks have rectified the Dark Universe debacle, but over a decade ago, we all knew Dracula Untold was doomed from the start, especially given that most of the scenes from the haunt were cut from the film. For better or worse, IPs like Dracula Untold or The Purge are what I call synergistic IPs, haunts or scare zones that seem to exist only to promote a property or act as a low-budget capacity machine that can be quickly built with recycled assets. Now that doesn't always mean bad, but it rarely means surprising. But it also poses an interesting conundrum. So how exactly do you tell this type of story in this type of environment? Directly translating exact scenes doesn't normally work out, but the ideas still need to be recognizable without feeling tacked on. Well, why not just create a brand new story set within the same universe? Well, believe it or not, Universal has done that. Perhaps most infamously in 2002's Maximum Carnage. Except Universal didn't exactly tell Marvel that their haunt would feature the graphic deaths of many of their iconic heroes. And I'm sure you can guess how that played out. Rights issues can make it a bit tricky, but I find that the best IP haunts lie somewhere between direct adaptation and original creation. Regardless, there's one crucial element that connects those blockbuster moments. You certainly didn't see it in this next one, the most egregious IP I've seen and the worst haunt of 2023. And no, I'm not talking about Chucky. Stranger Things 4 represented the worst aspects of synergy, taking absolutely zero risks with its subject matter and meandering through a layout with no solid direction. All the blockbuster moments that everyone was waiting to see felt pared down in their design, sometimes so basic it was almost insulting. For every unique or unexpected moment, there were 3 more that added no narrative or atmospheric value to one of the biggest IPs ever. HHN really gotta stop doing it dirty to hot guys named Eddie. At least a few moments were able to capture the magic and wistful nostalgia of the Hawkins crew, but is it always this difficult to breathe new life into a property that's already been done successfully? Every year that AMC brought The Walking Dead to HHN, they brought something new, something bigger, something better. At least until 2015's The Living and the Dead arrived. After 3 consecutive record-breaking haunts that redefined how visceral these walkers could be, this 4th outing had to prove it wasn't simply more of the same. But first, let's go over the good. I'll never complain about the ambience, especially in that massive forest, or the unsuccessful yet innovative effects. Even if they didn't, well, blow the previous haunts out of the water. However, the scare setups took a nosedive, with many of the walkers feeling like harmless props placed throughout. The Living and the Dead looked great, yet a bit too familiar. And where its predecessors delivered on quantity and quality, this one mainly had the quantity. And sadly, I can say the same thing about 2017's The Shining, a legacy haunt that was far from. Here's an endless blue box bonanza instead of an effectively memorable vignette. Certain IPs have expectations that are carried with them, and The Shining failed to deliver, eschewing the wow factor of the Overlook Hotel or the panic-inducing hedge maze in favor of the most generic ideas you could think of. Even worse, the lack of dynamic lighting or any unique audio on these plain and generic sets failed to highlight the supernatural with no real atmosphere to speak of. Reaching in too many directions without a clear grasp on any, a few ingenious effects couldn't save The Shining from being an unexpected misfire. Well, speaking of misfires, 2015's Freddy vs. Jason kind of forgot about the versus part and spent most of its time rehashing the same kills we'd already seen from these titans of terror. If the scenic was more inventive and the scenes less cramped, venturing through the SparkNotes version of each franchise wouldn't have been a chore, but the openers were still more entertaining than the big event. Poorly conceived static dummies and blurry projections squandered all interest in this battle. At least when the Scaredy Cats tussle, I'm invested in the winner. The ideas were inspired, but the execution was apathetic. Not every single scene needs to be this huge showstopper, but every single one needs to matter.
Some of the mistakes that we've come across over the years developing Halloween is taking the guest and not giving them the credit that they deserve. They want to know why this maze is here, why this room is filled with bodies, why this creature is coming after me.
And if a scene isn't accomplishing any of that, is it really anything more than just mindless filler? That goes not just for originals, but IPs too. Sure, what the audience has already seen on screen is important, but maybe more so is the entire world off camera.
Because again, you've only experienced one way. You've seen the movie, you know when he comes out of the kitchen, he does the stab, does the head tilt, and then we cut. But this time, he does the head tilt, and then he's going to turn towards you, and you're now involved in that.
The real magic lies in the transition scenes, those small moments that build upon the atmosphere, connect the story beats, and catch us off guard. Those are the moments that determine the success of a haunt. Take something like 2022's Spirits of the Coven, a sinister speakeasy exploring the dark side of temptation. Devoid of nearly any context or explanation between scenes, this high-concept haunt failed to support its leading ladies in nearly every way.
They want to know why this maze is here, why this room is filled with bodies, why this creature is coming after me.
Regardless, I still think the ominous emptiness in the underground sections and the labyrinth feel of the latter half remain a highlight of the last decade. However, the lack of audio from the Coven members themselves remains a very low point. I don't rank haunts based off characters, because man, did some of these actors make magic out of nothing. And if these characters had anything worthwhile to say, or had more personality than wet cardboard, maybe this tale wouldn't seem so disjointed. And if I'm knocking spirits for being disjointed, I've gotta knock Chucky Ultimate Kill Count too. I'm a staunch Chucky defender, but I can't in good faith say that 2023 showing was an objectively good haunt. I'm not gonna beat a dead horse talking about the bad concept and terrible sets, but I am going to highlight the inventive costuming and the effective use of puppets and animatronics, something that's becoming rarer and rarer each year. Only mentioning Chucky's failures would be burying a plethora of stellar ideas that were simply overshadowed by a misguided execution. But that doesn't mean I forgive, well, all of this. What differentiates The Last of Us from its counterparts? It's like Universal took the Platinum Dunes approach to The Walking Dead. It's like the same thing you've already seen, but now it's even worse. I'm still not sure that recycling scenes only to end with a different payoff is a clever idea. If anything, it only showcases how similar The Last of Us is to every other zombie haunt that's been done to death over the last decade, only with exceptionally better costuming. The biggest scenes did nothing at all, seriously, nothing at all happened, and the smallest ones tried to cram in the most impactful scares. Slow, meandering, surprisingly generic, and unable to create a sense of tension or gain momentum. By the time it finally felt like The Last of Us, I was wishing I was this guy, especially with the impending trek back to Kid Zone. It would also be easy to say that 2022's Hellblock Horror was another generic and forgettable romp. Yet despite the endless boo box barrage of scares, this cast of resurrected characters was committed to the bit. It's only unfortunate most of these creatures were never designed to be the focal points of their haunt, and the generic environments did little to help us remember who they are or why we should be afraid. Where Hellblock Horror really excelled was with the HHN references, not to mention creating brand new languages for each species. And I don't know if I can name another haunt that nailed an intense facade and finale. Even if just barely, Hellblock Horror is an objectively good haunt, something I couldn't say in this video until now. But I think it's important we all take a moment to recognize how failure can lead to growth. Many ideas you'll see later in this countdown evolve from concepts that didn't necessarily work out. Plus, I'm sure we've all had a laugh looking back at a project we thought was amazing at the time, and it wasn't. So down in the comments, let's all share some love for our favorite failures and what we learned from them, because I think this next one is my pick.
OJ, idiot.
A new classic. 2024's Triplets of Terror was messy in a variety of ways, but I think it achieved the chaotic suburban atmosphere better than most. While the sound design was obnoxious and threatening, it was never overbearing. But the amount of story beats in such a small footprint were. The gleeful triplets are a highlight with their trademark styles, but a jarring transition to the industrial side of town doesn't really allow enough time to celebrate this birthday bash. Too many empty scenes and wasted space where I'd rather see the Barmies slashing through suburbia. You know what? I'm gonna say it. Blumhouse Productions may be one of the best things to happen to HHN in a while. 2018's The Horrors of Blumhouse, Volume 2, is only half of a great haunt, but these fun and digestible jump scares are perfectly tailored for HHN's formula, and sometimes simplicity done exceptionally well is a nice reprieve. The first Purge certainly didn't earn much redemption by squandering all that vertical space and just kind of existing, but Happy Death Day was phenomenal. Up-close scares with in-your-face sound design and a smattering of surprisingly suspenseful scare setups, this succeeded in all the areas where Triplets of Terror fumbled. I'd almost say Happy Death Day is my favorite Blumhouse section out of all of them. And let's call a spade and say that, beat for beat, 2022's The Horrors of Blumhouse was about even with its predecessor. Freaky had about as many standout scenes as the first Purge, which was like 1.5. Yet the Black Phone was a surprising and unrelenting nightmare, at least for the most part. Darkness is typically used as a crutch for bad scenic, but there was just enough texture in these corridors to make my skin crawl. Most will forget about a lot of the moments in this episode, but I'll never forget the feeling of holding my breath while sneaking past the grabber. Ugh. For our rewards, the scaredy cat for the scariest overall scene goes to the totally killer Happy Death Day parking garage in Blumhouse 2018. And the soiled shorts for the best characters to these hulking hunks and spirits of the coven. The melted plastic for best facade, I'm actually gonna give to Triplets of Terror. Low-key, unsettling, and filled with foreshadowing, this subdued intro taps into a style of horror we need much more of at HHN. And the big brain for best effects to this freaky transition in Blumhouse 2022. Even in the worst haunts, there's many inspired effects, but none manage to be as unexpected, plot-driven, or scary as this compact scene. So far, we've counted 20 of 125 haunts, and even though 2015 and 2022 aren't faring so well, that could all change very soon. Now, by the end of the next 20, do you think any of these 5 years with clean slates will still remain unscathed? Head to HHN H2H to prove me wrong and vote for your favorite haunts, and click that join button for an exclusive viewing party of each Countdown episode a week before the public release. I'm SixBillium, this is the HHN Countdown. Now, check this out.